Kurt, thanks so much for the invitation. It is great to be here, and I guess Kurt's comments remind us that there is no such thing as a free dinner. But it has been great to visit Northern Illinois really many times over the last couple decades, and then to join in those gatherings at the ICMA meeting. This is a very special place, a very wonderful program, and all of you gathered here really captures what is so distinctive. The wonderful, tight bond between the alumni of this program and the practitioners in the northern part of Illinois and the MPA program here really make it very distinctive. So it's nice to have both current students and practitioners and mentors and intern supervisors together for this discussion. This is a time for some anniversaries. Next year will be ICMA's 100th anniversary. First manager gathering was in 1914. ASPA turns 75 next year, and we'll be commemorating that event. Last year was the 20th anniversary of reinventing government, and took us a little time to get organized with the Alliance for Innovation, with which I worked at Arizona State, has organized several discussions talking about the significance of reinventing government and what it might mean today. And if anyone is going to be at the ICMA meeting on the Sunday, there will be a third session. Both Ted Gabler and David Osborne will be there, and it's really interesting to hear about what led to the writing of the book, how they got their information, and then do some assessment of what its impact has been over the last 20 years. There were two earlier workshops that were held that I participated in, and it was very interesting to go back, and I think it tells us a lot about both the nature of the local government practice field, but also about the nature of the academic field of local government. We weren't really as up on changes that were occurring as these observers were. But so if you have a chance to take part in that on Sunday, it will be an interesting discussion. And this is your 50th anniversary. That too is an important anniversary and a noteworthy one, as I'll point out later in my remarks. I have some supporting illustrations that I will use from time to time, but this will not be a PowerPoint presentation, so don't worry that slides just sit there for a while. As background, as I thought about these remarks and the topic that Kurt asked me to talk about, it turned out to be a challenging topic. What do we mean when we talk about legacy? How do we assess the impact of professional local government as part of the totality of the change in government administration in the United States and in the field of public administration generally? We need to remember that at the present time there are almost as many local government staff members as there are at the state and federal level combined. And there has always been that imbalance. So everything about the field of public administration has an impact on local government, but the numbers of people and the numbers of governments at the local level, cities, counties, and other local units of government, have a real big impact on the field, and I wanted to try to draw out what some of those were. When we think about legacy, a legacy is a gift, or generally something handed down from the past, and I think that's what I was trying to identify. What are the valuable gifts that come from the past in local government professionalism? But then what are the implications for the future? And are these legacies still relevant in terms of the generational change that we talked about in the earlier session, and also in terms of some of the current challenges that are facing local government specifically and government generally? Is local government professionalism still relevant? Are those legacies still appropriate moving forward? Well, when we think about the gifts from professional local government, the most obvious one, the area that is part of the standard narrative, if you will, about the development of public administration as a field, is that professional management in local government reduced corruption, improved accountability, and expanded expertise in local government. So the first gift is more competent, more accountable, and more ethical government. It was the reform period in the early 20th century was a time of ferment generally, but the local governments were on the front line of public sector reform. It was at the local level that new practices, new approaches were developed and were tested out. It's where we saw the beginnings of a process of elevating the quality of public officials working in government, where we started coming up with some reasonable bases for differentiating professional standards for action on the one hand and political grounds for actions on the other. And that relationship between politics and administration has always been one of the key dynamics of administration at all levels, and an area of great interest to me in my own research and writing. Now, I will focus a lot on the development of the council manager form and the leadership positions in local government, but it's important to remember that this transformation was occurring throughout all specialized areas of local government practice. So there has been a widespread professionalization of government practice in public works, in police, in finance, in personnel, that is occurring throughout local governments, regardless of their form of government. But the combination of that specialized improvement within the context of the council manager form of government provided a special setting for developing new approaches and new attitudes. The professional local government managers provided a new model for the way that officials communicated with each other. ICMA specifically pioneered the development of a code of ethics. This was rare. William Mosher, in an article he wrote in 1938, sort of setting the stage for the formation of ASPA the next year, and Mosher would become the first president of ASPA, identified the qualities that were essential to have a profession of public administration. And one of those was a code of ethics. And he could only cite ICMA, and he mentioned teachers' associations, as the only examples of professional organizations in government that had codes of ethics. So that development of ethical standards, the enforcement of ethical standards in local government really was important in laying the foundation for developments that would come again and come later in other areas. Let me just, as a side note, point out that this year, ASPA has revised its code of ethics, adopted a new code of ethics, and I was involved in the group that came up with that new draft. We are now looking at the issues of how to implement it and how to make it more meaningful. And in connection with that, I hope that there can be much more communication between ASPA with its broad, overreaching statements of standards and ethics and the more specialized statements of a variety of organizations, including ICMA, and looking at models for how the two codes can work together. Now, it is important to remember, as Banfield and Wilson pointed out in their important city politics textbook in 1963, that most of the places that adopted reforms, that adopted these new approaches to government, never had experienced corruption themselves. They were relatively small, moderately sized, often suburban communities. And some people have never forgotten that generalization and still think that that's the case. But in retrospect, testing out these ideas, developing them within that more select group of governments was very important because they have expanded out beyond that original base to cities of all kinds and counties as well. So that first gift is one that we obviously recognize, improving the quality, accountability, and ethics in local government administration. The second gift is one about which there has been more debate, more uncertainty. and this is the role that administrators will play in shaping policy. In what ways are city managers and other top administrators active in helping to advise elected officials about the policy choices that local government should make? And there have been changes in views about this question over time. I have two quotes here that I'd like for you to look at and suggest approximately when these might have been made. The manager must, quote, show himself to be a leader, formulating policies and urging their adoption by the council. The second, to ask a city manager to avoid incursion into policy would be to set up an impossible distinction between policy and administration. It would be in effect to ask him not to be a city manager. So write down the dates that you think these statements might have been made. I'll give you 5 seconds to do that. From this side of the room, what are the dates that you would suggest for that first statement? Anybody want to throw out a number here? 1935, okay. Anybody else think early? Yes?
Me?
Yes.
1901.
1901, okay. Anybody have a different idea, a more recent one? 2013. Okay, all right. 1913. What about the second statement over here? 2013. Okay, 2013. So we got a range. What about the second statement? 1960. Any other? Anybody want to push another date? 90. Did I hear? 1990s. Okay. All right. 94. All right. Well, I mean, I think that reflects, although here we got a range of dates here, that reflects kind of the view that in the beginning, managers weren't involved in policy, and they weren't supposed to be. Over time, they have taken on this responsibility. Well, the first statement was from 1919. It was the part of a very important document, if you will, the basic text and then explanation for the second model city charter. And they saw the manager's role as being a very active and comprehensive one, and expected that managers would play an active role in developing policy proposals and urging their adoption. Now, there was no question in the minds of those who formulated the council manager plan and recommended that it be adopted in cities throughout the United States. There was no question that the ultimate authority for making that decision would be the city council, but they expected the manager to be an active participant. Field studies in the 1940s, but then this second statement came in on the basis of a field study in 1941. In actuality, managers are involved both in shaping policy as well as carrying it out. And yet, despite the long-standing nature of these quotes, and then here's another one, again, going back to 1918 from, if not the godfather of the council manager forum, certainly the #1 salesperson for the council manager forum, Richard Childs, a quote that includes a phrase that was used in an ICMA report: "Someday we will have at these manager meetings managers who have achieved national reputation not by saving taxes or cutting per capita expenses, but managers who have successfully led their commissions into great new enterprises of service." So what is unique about the forum is not that you have a body of elected officials and then a hired technician to carry it out. You have a combination of two different kinds of leaders, two different perspectives that are working together. Now, the ICMA code in the first version in 1924, in Richard Stillman's views, and this is his quote, this is the line from the code. The council primarily determines the municipal policies, leaving open that someone else has an influence as well. The manager has an influence as well. By 1938, Richard Stillman would conclude that the dichotomy model, the dichotomy of politics and administration, was incorporated into the Code of Ethics. The preamble says that that policy shall be determined exclusively by the council. And it states in Tenet 5, matching up with the first version, the city manager is in no sense a political leader. So that seemed to be a new statement of what the expectations were. But then let me jump ahead to this statement of an ICMA president in 1948 who talks about the importance of the manager as a community leader, a positive, vital force in the community, thinking about the broad objectives that are needed to improve community life. Should he bring those proposals to the council? And he points out that if the manager doesn't, important issues will be lost sight of. Opportunities for change will not be recognized. The manager visualizes broad objectives, distant goals, far-sighted projects. So one of the elements of that professional perspective on policy was that long-term perspective, was a focus on what does the community need to do to advance the public interest. So how do we reconcile this discrepancy between the new orthodoxy in the 30s and then Harold's statement 10 years later? I think that the original intention of what the founders of the forum meant was clear from their commentary. They expected the manager to be an active leader. We cannot ignore how important the impact of the Depression was on the behavior of managers and on the statement of standards. At a time when there was no money, when any public actions were very difficult to be carried out, it may have been helpful for managers to be able to say, it wasn't my idea, I didn't come up with it, that's the manager's responsibility. There was a drop in the number of cities using the council manager form during that time. A manager's position was an extra expense that some cities dropped. So in part, that may explain part of the reason. But I think it's another aspect of this that is important to remember, and that is the way that these terms, particularly this term manager as a politician, were understood at the time. In a book on form of government written by Bishop in 1945, he said there are two schools of thought on the manager's role. One, that the manager should be an active leader who takes his positions to the public if the council doesn't adopt them. Now, this is a real politician. And this manager is acting as a virtual appointed mayor. And I think that in that 1938 code, when the manager said the manager is in no sense a politician, it was in that sense. And there was a city manager, Hopkins, in Cleveland in the 20s, who stood out and was frequently referred to as someone who went too far, who saw himself as being a professional expert whose ideas were better than the council's, and if the council didn't adopt them, he would take them to the public. So in part, it may be that a distinction was being made. There was the expectation the manager would not be advocating, pushing policies, but he should urge his plans upon the council. This is the second school, but make no effort to force their decision or to reverse it once they have decided. The manager cannot help influencing policy no matter how hard he may try. So again, there had been this shift in views that raised questions about the appropriateness of the manager's participation. But I looked back at the 38 code again and saw something I'd never noticed before. That last, so as you read, we saw the first part before, the manager provides the council with information and advice, but he encourages positive decisions on policy by the council instead of passive acceptance of his recommendations. Now, wait a minute. These managers who have nothing to do with policy are making recommendations. The state of affairs is recognized that councils may, without sufficient question or leadership on their own part, accept them. So I think what it suggests, and this would be an interesting area for research for someone who would like to delve into this historical period. I think that when we consider the kinds of settings in which the council manager form was found in the 30s and early 40s, mainly moderate, small communities, homogeneous communities, councils that were dominated by men, by business leaders and professionals. To the outside world, the manager could say, I'm the implementer. I do what the council tells me to do. But on the inside, the manager and those council members were very much alike in their background and perspective. And the manager was part of, really, the leadership team in the community without having to proclaim it. In a sense, then, managers during the 30s were invisible leaders that the profession was not fully recognizing. That would change, but I think it helps explain part of this period. So let me just go back then to summarize this point. I think the second gift, although one that we're still working on, is the creation of a working model of the top administrator as a comprehensive professional leader who's involved in all aspects of what local government does. And we look at the city manager, county manager as being an example of what administrators at other levels will do as well. By the way, in Europe, when there is ready use of the term chief executive officer to refer to the city manager type in Northern Europe and Scandinavia, as you talk to managers there, they say my most important responsibility is advising the council, helping them make decisions, identifying problems, developing plans and proposals. I also manage the organization, but actually European managers need to strengthen their management skills. But that recognition of the advisory role is very well established in Europe. We have a working model for it, and we're still working on understanding it. So the third gift, then implicit in what I've been saying, is a new structure of government. A new structure that is characterized by distinctive principles of governance. You know, I spoke to Kim Nelson's class Wednesday morning at the University of North Carolina, and she says hello to all of you here, sorry she couldn't be here for this occasion. I talked to the students in the class about form of government, and we recognized again what a complex topic this is. The United States is the only country in the world that makes widespread use of two different forms of government at the local level. And those forms are based on different constitutional principles. The true blue American way of organizing government is separation of powers. You have elected executives, legislative bodies that have offsetting powers, each able to check the other. The council manager form reflects a unitary allocation of authority. All authority is ultimately placed in the elected council. And the council transfers, the charter transfers authority to the manager to advise the council and carry out the council's decision. It makes it possible then for a flow of information and communication to occur from elected officials through the manager to the staff and vice versa. And remembering that staff members are often, as managers themselves are, reaching out to the community and in extensive communication with residents of the community in the information and recommendations that work their way back up to the council. It's not an executive pushing one agenda, a legislative body with its own or separate or opposing agenda. We observe at the national level, at state levels, the kind of impasse which so commonly occurs in separation of power settings. So the council manager form is one that's very different, but because it's so different, it's very hard for people to understand. And we have to keep working on that and keep communicating that to our students as well as to the public. But this kind of odd idea for organizing government in ways that are atypical to the American constitutional tradition began to take hold. This chart starts in 1933 The first council manager government is credited as occurring in Staunton, Virginia in 1908. There's some arguments about that, but in 1908. It was endorsed in the Model City Charter in 1915, and some governments, a few governments, decided to take on that new and untested form of government. By 1933, there were around 400. The star represents the time when what university adopted a Master of Public Administration program? This is the point when NIU began the MPA degree. Now, I'm not saying that everything that followed after that can be attributed to the formation of the NIU program. But it was, and we'll come back to this in a minute, it was an important time of change in universities as well. And Northern Illinois was actually early in its creation of the MPA form. But you can see that there was not much change during the Depression or World War II, but then the explosion began. And it was driven a great deal by the expansion of suburban communities, and that was the setting in which the council manager form initially was most attractive. But the numbers have grown, and you can see from the size bars, it's growing in cities of all sizes. There are now cities, 3 cities over 1 million in population that use the council manager form. 3 cities over 500,000 that do, and one of those will move, San Jose will move into the million-plus category. There still are issues and challenges about the form in very, very large places, but in cities up to 250,000, it is by far the predominant form of government that is being used. One of the key elements is that the city manager is responsible to the council as a whole, and is not dependent upon the support and backing of one leader like the mayor. It's ironic, considering all of the words that have been written and spoken about the separation of politics and policy from administration in the council manager form. In actuality, the form promotes interaction between the two spheres in a more natural, fuller way than occurs in separation of power settings, where mayors will often sit on information and not provide the information to the council about policy options except the one that he wants to push, or provide information about performance or accomplishments that the staff is achieving. There is much fuller information exchange, flow of communication between elected officials and administrators in the council manager form. And since the manager serves the council as a whole, that communication predominantly occurs in public. Citizens can observe that exchange as well. So the form also promotes inherently a higher level of transparency than is found in the workings of separation of power settings. Now, this model of having an appointed board, a board of directors, council, and an appointed administrative director actually is quite common if you look across sectors in the United States. I mean, not only do other local governments use it, like special districts, school districts, and so on. It's the dominant form of organization in nonprofit organizations as well. So those same dynamics are one that we can observe across most organizations in the United States. Despite its grounding in the Constitution, the separation of powers approach is actually the less typical, but it is the one that dominates public perceptions about government roles and how government works. So the form spread. By the way, in 1963, there were 57 council manager governments in Illinois. And of those 57 governments, 14 were served by their first city manager. So those were long sitting managers or a relatively recent adoption. So think about how it has expanded in Illinois and expanded throughout the country. And so that generalization from Banfield and Wilson that the council manager form is limited to small homogeneous places had some historical accuracy in the 50s and 60s, but it has become more and more out of touch with the reality since that time. There was another development that was occurring simultaneous with and helping to promote the growth of the adoption of the form, and that was the expansion in professional education in public administration. There was a survey done at the end of the 50s which identified 100 institutions that offered coursework in public administration, but most of those were very small, few courses in departments of political science. Only a few, in fact, they estimated a dozen large programs that focused on public administration. So NIU adopting the MPA in 1963 was at the early stage of this new recognition of the importance of public administration as a field, and it was always a leader in its focus on local government as part of the total field. You can see the figures of growth between 66 and 74. And these are programs that were separate in one of those ways listed there. So that there was an increase from 57 in 1966 to 140 in 1974, and that growth continued as well. Again, this reciprocal relationship between the expansion of programs on the one hand and the expansion of professional local government on the other. There was also a shift in the way that we thought about how students should be educated. The focus on the technical aspects of public administration at the local level were pretty strong in the 30s and 40s. The chief handbook from ICMA was titled The Technique of Municipal Administration, published in 1947, and provided detailed discussions of the management practices used in various parts of local government. There was an important kind of reorientation that occurred and was reflected in the book edited by Jim Banovitz, Managing the Modern City, published in 1971. And that book has been around for so long, it's easy to think, oh, gee, there was always something like that. Well, before 1971, there was not. Something that reflected in that organized new perspectives on the field of public administration. And so he talked about the new expectations for managers, the new job requirements, the new kinds of challenges and demands that they are faced. And so Managing the Modern City was organized around these topics: leadership roles and strategies, resolving community problems, organization theory, so on. These were not present in earlier versions. So there is this, again, this reciprocal change that's going on, expansion in the number. We also need to recognize that in the 1960s, a lot of other things were going on. There was an expansion in the functions that governments were attempting to address, including, for the first time, a wide range of social and community development programs that had not been local government responsibilities before, initially with federal government inducements and incentives. There were changes in the composition of city councils during this time. The introduction of district elections became much more common in cities in the 60s in response in part to the civil rights movement. And so the dynamics and the leadership challenges that managers face were much broader and more diverse. And Managing the Modern City was a first step by ICMA to reflect that and go beyond what had been the purpose of the previous handbook, discussing those techniques for managing the moderate-sized community. So cities and counties and communities of all sizes were being included. So that even though we think about the characteristics of professionals as including a common body of knowledge, that did not mean before the 60s and 70s a distinctive kind of education that was oriented toward the full range of challenges that managers faced. The traditional managers through the 50s into the 60s were not simply technicians, as some members of the public administration profession want to dismiss them as, but they were relatively untrained in handling the policy development and community building challenges that were going on. They couldn't have ignored them, but that wasn't part of their training. Most of them had come from backgrounds in engineering into the 40s and 50s. So again, we see a dramatic shift then in the level of advanced education and in the focus of that advanced education. In 1934, only 13% of the members of ICMA, city managers, had a master's degree. And most of them, their background was typically in engineering. By 1963, again, at this critical year, only 23% of managers had a master's degree at that point, and 18% of those had MPAs. By 2012, that percentage had increased to 74% overall and 47% with the MPA. So NIU has been part of and a leader in this real transformation in the way we think about the field and the way we prepare people to fill it. Just one other area of change that I wanted to note, and that is a period of reorienting and redesigning government that would then follow in the 70s and 80s and 90s and continue to this day. Certainly the 1980s, and I was reminded of this, again, preparing for the Reinventing Government workshops that we did. The 1980s were a time of strain, of upheaval, tax revolts, budget cuts. There was, can you imagine, political deadlock in Washington between our leaders at the national level about how we should proceed, what approaches we should take. Osborne and Gabler wrote in Reinventing Government, published in 1992, about the 80s. Visionary state and local leaders gradually began to adjust, developing new practices and new vocabularies. Suddenly, the field of government was brimming with new catchphrases: public-private partnerships, alternative service delivery, contracting out, empowerment, TQM, participatory management, privatization, load shedding. So there was a period of great change that Osborne and Gabler were essentially capturing. They didn't create these approaches. Ted Gabler himself had been someone that had used them, but these were the new approaches that local government managers and elected officials at the state and local level were coming up with on their own. In some ways, there was there had been 20 years worth of accumulating changes. Certainly the citizen participation efforts go back to the 1960s and were one of the important forces that would keep stimulating change. There was wider variety of partnerships. Contracting out in 1992 was already well established in the survey done by ICMA in that year, so that was not a new idea. And by the way, Osborne and Gabler said very clearly, privatization is one answer to new approaches, not the answer. A lot of the critics have been very selective in the parts of the original book that they have picked out to focus on in their criticisms. But what they did and provided this kind of framework for was a kind of a period of change spread throughout the sector that was not yet adequately recognized in the academic literature. Another important factor that was underlying these changes was new technology. Now, you know, in 1990, what you could do with your computer wasn't all that fantastic, but there were changes that were occurring. And it's very important to recognize that at all levels of government and society, for that matter, one of the important driving forces for change is change in technology, and specifically the reduction in information costs. As information becomes more readily and widely available, new kinds of work arrangements, new kinds of partnerships, new kinds of sharing are possible that could not have been done before. I mean, I'm sure you've often thought, why didn't Max Weber's bureaucrats just open up their laptops and send emails to each other? Well, they couldn't do that. There was reference to the menial tasks that young employees often get assigned. Most staff members in governments, when Max Weber was writing and before, was copying forms by hand. The organization, the bureaucracy was designed to control, but to coordinate and to make certain that very expensive, scarce information could be located and could be gotten to the person who needs it. So lots of the characteristics that we associate with that form really are necessitated by that need. We have seen this enormous broadening, flattening of the organization, and we're just at the beginning of those trends. But they were beginning to affect what was possible at that point. So reinventing government captured a wide range of changes, and those changes continue. So I think that the important point to make here is that there are a range of gifts that have come from the legacies that come from professional local government management, more competent, accountable, and ethical government, this working model of a comprehensive top administrator, a new form of government, new approaches to education and research, a new commitment to engage citizens and build community, and openness to new relationships, citizen engagement, and innovation. So it is an impressive body of accomplishments. And there is certainly influences from one level of government across to other levels that occurred. Certainly some of the important changes that occurred in local government came as a result of federal government action. But at its base, I think professional local government management has been a driving force and the testing ground for the changes, the developments that are reflected in these legacies. Now, where are we now, and where are we going? I was inspired by the discussion after breakfast to pull a slide out of an old presentation and stick it in, and I updated it, I hope accurately, to the current year. I'd had this updated in 2011. This is the size of the generations that we were talking about this morning. And then if you look along the bottom, how old these people are right now. And there is an important thing that was noted in the comments this morning. The size of the millennials as well as the Xers, and to a lesser extent the baby boom generation, has been augmented by immigration. I mean, it is younger people who are coming into the country beyond the number that resulted from natural birth within the United States. But you see that large group of millennials who are working their way through. Generation Xers, and we need, as we talk about generational change, to not ignore the Xers. There's a real risk that those who are between 33 and 47 will be passed over for promotions for the positions they've been waiting for, thinking, when are the boomers ever going to leave? For 10 years, we've been hearing about this retirement tsunami. Where's the tsunami? Of course, that those retirement patterns were affected by the recession. Some people extended their employment longer than they might have. But the Xers have enormous experience and are in a position to really take over positions they've been preparing for a long time. They just can't catch a break, though. The Xers were criticized for being too small. Oh, there aren't enough of you. There is this big deficit, population deficit, following the baby boomers. But they weren't given as many years. So they were shortchanged on the number of years in the generation, which partly accounts for that. Another key thing to note here is that the baby boom generation had more people toward the back end than the front end of the age distribution. So if you think that all the boomers are about to leave, that still isn't going to happen. There are a lot who are still in the age group 48 to 57. But notice this figure, 67. The oldest boomers have already started reaching standard retirement age. So that change is finally coming. Over the next 10 years, we are going to see a transformation that we haven't seen since the early 70s, when, in part because of a big expansion in the number of governments that were being organized, as well as a smaller traditional age population, baby boomers were able to assume positions of responsibility in large numbers at an early age. And the same thing is going to happen with millennials. So 10 years from now, at the 60th anniversary, the students here will be back as practitioners who are occupying important positions of responsibility in your organizations. The change is coming, the technological balance of power has already shifted. The distribution of numbers is in the verge of shifting. The discussion this morning was very interesting. I think it captured the kind of dynamics, but I think we need to be thinking very carefully about what the new public service contract is. Bob O'Neill uses this term. What is the expectation? What's the agreement that we have between government and people that come to work for government? It's not going to be the old model of spending a career and getting a substantial retirement and having that provide a source of security while working and later on. And that's probably not the kind of future that millennials are looking for anyway. It is this notion of a career focused in a place or even in a profession is something that needs to be rethought. What is the workplace going to look like? What are our personnel, human resources practices going to be like? So much of the way we think about defining positions, qualifications, training, job assignments, and so on, represent a very fixed view about how organizations are structured and operate, a kind of a static view about the kinds of challenges that local governments face. And so we're going to need to develop new, more flexible arrangements. We're going to be able to incorporate more newcomers into the organization. There is I think a lot of discussion needs to take place now about what these models are going to be. What will the future local government look like in terms of its operating procedures and its physical structure and it's the way it operates? We heard a number of people comment this morning about the importance of providing opportunities for service and meaningful work. You know, one interesting thing to remember about that, there was a presentation at a conference a year or so ago when a most decidedly non-millennial person got up to the microphone and said, everybody wants that situation. Some of the characteristics that we identify as being important to attract and retain millennials would actually have widespread appeal to everybody within the organization. So let's not think about this as a big generational gulf in terms of preferences. But there was a city manager on an ICMA task force a couple years ago talking about the challenge of competing with nonprofits. And he said, you know, local governments just have real difficulty attracting young professionals. You go to work for a nonprofit and you get to start doing meaningful things from day one. Yeah, and you know, we can't do that. Well, why not? It is going to be increasingly important that connections be made between the specific tasks that someone's assigned to, the specific job that you have, and the bigger picture, the broader implications, as well as new kinds of opportunities for working across the organization, between the organization and the community. It is important that succession planning not be a top-down process. Baby boomers cannot design by themselves what the future will be to accommodate young professionals. There needs to be sharing in that process. One aspect that I think that academic programs need to look at is how service learning programs are organized and how local governments are involved in those programs. It is still very common for service learning programs to focus on work in nonprofits and other kinds of community organizations. And governments, although they provide opportunities for internships or job shadowing and so on, those presume that you have a pretty focused interest in local government already, and maybe even some relevant course work background to be able to be given assignments. That broad exposure to the purpose and the importance of local government through service learning projects needs to be extended to more undergraduates than are getting it now. There was a study done, and it's now 10 years old, but a study done by Brookings Institute in 2003 of college seniors. These were students majoring in humanities, social sciences, social work, and education. And only 28% of the students said that working for government was completely public service, whereas 58% saw working for nonprofits in that way. More than half of the college seniors had had experience with nonprofit organizations, compared with just 8% who had experienced either state or local government. So as we reach out and try to attract and incorporate a new generation into local government, we need to start reaching them through these more general outreach efforts while they're undergraduates. And the service learning courses is a great opportunity for doing that. And the interest that millennials have in a diverse career that will move across sectors is very strongly established. So let's recognize that and provide opportunities for being exposed to other sectors in conjunction with work in government. Again, a task force that might involve working on a problem with nonprofits. More and more organizations we're seeing are setting up cross-organizational, cross-age innovation task forces that are assigned a problem and are coming up with an innovative approach to deal with that problem. And those can include community representatives as well. Another general expectation that will be important for advancing a general commitment to citizen engagement as well is to encourage staff members in local governments to volunteer in community activities. I'm sure a lot of your staff members are already doing that. But it not only gets your people out, it broadens their exposure and helps them understand the citizens with whom they increasingly are trying to engage. And and citizen engagement is not just something we ought to do because it's nice. It's something we have to do because the problems we're trying to address now cannot be solved by government alone. To address issues of sustainability or community health or thinking about old, long-standing problems like security in neighborhoods, it takes active contribution by active involvement by residents in the community as well as the work of government. And increasingly, government needs to be the convener rather than the initiator of programs. So, final point, again, we need to think about how we attract people into local government from other sectors and welcome back those who have worked in government, have gone to work for nonprofits, and now are ready to come back. One other final set of comments, and that's to look at some of the challenges that are being faced currently. We use legacy in another sense. We talk about legacy systems. Is professional local government management a legacy system? One of those outdated, obsolete systems that is not appropriate to current problems? My answer would be no, but we have to recognize that there are some new kinds of current of thought that are abroad. One thing, the organizations have changed and the relationships of the community have changed. Again, we often want to stereotype old organizations as being highly bureaucratic, top-down, and all the rest. But they were ones in which managers were, I've used the word, more assured about their position. They were pretty much recognized as being the top person in the organization, which still had more elements of hierarchy. They could pretty much set the terms of their involvement in the community. They would often be involved, as has been happening for a long time, with other leadership groups at the local level. And they could see themselves as being the primary policy advisor, the primary source of information for their elected officials. All those conditions are changing. Starting with the last one, there are now, the information explosion applies to city council members as well as everybody else. And there are lots of groups that are targeting local government officials to promote their point of view, their policy cause, their political ideology. Managers are now in a position of competing in their efforts to provide information and recommendations to city councils. It is no longer up to the manager to decide, how involved will I be in the community? A high level of engagement is going to be required. And our organizations are flatter, and they are going to be even more so, in part because the new technology, where everybody has at their desktop virtually all the information available about that city or county. Those organizations can operate differently, and they can locate their staff differently. So the manager's position at the center has been diminished somewhat. Some people who are familiar with an earlier time may view that as being a diminishment of their status. Life is more difficult than it used to be. But I think that these are provide new opportunities as well. We certainly are seeing increased suspicion of professionals in all categories. And although city managers haven't been singled out yet, actually I did see a borderline case where the argument was made, oh, well, those executives representing the permanent staff are trying to protect the staff perspective in their own organization. And so all boards, public and private, need to have their own appointed staff member who would serve as a check on the professional staff. So as we prepare for a future leadership positions, we need to recognize that managers are often presiding over a range of actors that they only vaguely control. We talked at our table this morning about the issues of accountability that arise with new forms of collaborative decision making. But we're going to need to confront that. And local government professionals probably have thought more about issues of accountability than other people have. So it's something we need to address. So the environment and work content is uncertain and unpredictable, and managers will need to be adaptive in their outlook and their behavior. But as you look at that job description and those conditions, I would argue that that may be a more attractive job description for young professionals than the traditional one was, that these conditions are not so alien and so threatening. So there are opportunities to use your key position. The organization of chief executives in Great Britain, Solace, referred to their members as senior strategic managers. And as we do more multi-participant network activities, knowing who's involved and what they're working on becomes a key resource, and managers will have a real advantage with regard to that position. I think this will be more attractive to young professionals who are likely to expect extensive give and take with politicians, to work in networks and be facilitators of citizen engagement. We will need to be nimble, to be adaptive in the future, but there are these key responsibilities that top administrators can have. So I hope that this will be an attractive opportunity that the young professionals in this room will move toward and be willing to adopt. So I just to complete the presentation, there was a project a couple years ago. Jim Keene, John Nalbandian, Bob O'Neill, Sharon Portillo, and I tried to summarize what the key practices were that bring value to communities and organizations from their professional administrators. And this is the list that we come up with, and I think it reflects these legacies, the legacies that we identified. Professionals add value to the quality of public policy in their advisory role and produce results that matter to their community. They take a long-term and community-wide perspective. They are committed to ethical practices. They help build community and support democratic and community values, promote equitable, fair outcomes and processes, Professionals develop and sustain organizational excellence and promote innovation. That was part of the list that was published in that 2007 article in PM Magazine. And I added this last one because increasingly we're seeing examples of lots of new approaches, experimenting with new kinds of partnerships across jurisdictions and across sectors to meet the goals of the community. So I think looking at these contributions that are being made, that can still be made, we can say the legacy continues. And thanks for being here, and I'd be happy to have your comments and questions.